That those most opposed to climate action are also those who want Canada to surrender into becoming a US state is unsurprising. US conquest has usually happened as a result of the influence of oil and gas corporations, and the interests of Canadian national sovereignty and those of oil and gas corporations are increasingly going in separate ways. Welcome to a special edition of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast by Sierra Club Canada. I am your host, Connor Curtis. Today's episode is on resisting the US annexation of Canada, or rather we should say the annexation of Canada by the oil and gas corporations behind Trump's approaching US administration. Given the importance of this topic, we are skipping our normal introduction. Suffice it to say, you can find out more about this podcast on your platform of choice, and you can find more about us at sierraclub.ca or on social media via Sierra Club Canada. From the second Trump mentioned the idea of Canada being a US state, it should have been clear he was not joking. People may laugh at some of the things he says, and the things he says may seem ridiculous, but he is a man who does not actually joke about his intentions. If you think it can't happen, look at all of the things we were told could not happen and have happened, how far reality can be stretched, and what people have been convinced to believe about climate change, about health, and about world politics. The idea that Canada could be annexed by the US might seem ridiculous. But if you checked out what the most ardent climate deniers here in Canada are saying, it becomes clear that an attempt to make this happen is already underway. It is an attempted annexation being fought not with troops, tanks, and fighter jets, at least not yet. It is an annexation being fought with words, images, digital bots, social media, and media relations. The way Trump talks about Canada is the way China talks about the regions it wants to annex, and it's the way Russia talks about the places it wants to annex. And that should be disturbing enough to us. It's a way of talking that implies we are already annexed, that we have already lost any distinct identity. Already in Trump's minds and words, and in the minds of those corporations that support Trump, we are a US state. We are going to talk at the end of this podcast about what you can do to resist US annexation. But first, let's talk about why the annexation calls are coming from the sources that they are coming from. The idea of Canada becoming a US state should be a bad joke. But instead we are seeing calls for a Canada-US statehood movement from the same accounts and personalities that normally spread corporate oil and gas propaganda. There is no joke here, and it's more than just coincidence that these are the voices we are hearing this from. Oil and gas corporations have not only made this situation possible, but stand to profit from the erosion of Canadian sovereignty directly. More importantly, they have directly backed President Trump financially and continue to back him and to spread his ideologies here in Canada through sympathetic voices. Trump has promised these corporations directly that he will stall renewable energy growth and drill for oil and gas without limit or consideration for environmental or social impact. Oil and gas corporations may continue to try and convince Canadians they are on our side with their official direct corporate voices. In reality, they are actively funding and promoting the voices most opposed to continued Canadian independence. They have also been funding climate denial and delayism for years, knowing that the result would be increased social instability and a likely shift towards totalitarianism. And we should not be surprised. Oil and gas companies have shown zero restraint in supporting totalitarian governments or annexations when it has been in their best interest to do so in the past. These corporations show zero regard for those who will suffer as a result of climate change. It should be no surprise that Canada is not special to them. Because oil and gas corporations are motivated by profit. For a time, the self-interest of these companies did legitimately align to some extent with the interests of Canadian national sovereignty, and it would be foolish to say there have been no benefits for our country for workers that were derived from oil and gas. But increasingly, the profit motives of oil and gas corporations no longer align with the national best interests of Canada, and oil and gas corporations are aware of this. We've gotten into this subject with several economic and energy experts on previous episodes, but here's a quick summary of why Canada's interests and these corporate interests no longer share the same goal. Firstly, many of their proposed oil and gas expansion projects in Canada, like East Coast gas export facilities, have no business case unless they also receive huge sums of money from Canadian taxpayers in support. In the United States, the Department of Energy has warned that unfettered exports of gas would increase wholesale domestic natural gas prices by over 30% by 2050. In Canada, the International Institute for Sustainable Development writes, quote, "The economics for new LNG production are weakening. As demand is estimated to have already peaked in advanced economies such as Europe and South Korea, LNG demand growth in emerging Asian markets is also projected to slow." We already contribute huge amounts of taxpayer money to prop up oil and gas corporations. Thus, even though oil and gas corporations, while only 5% of our national economy, represent around 30% of our national emissions. For these future projects to succeed, the support would need to grow significantly and would leave Canadians footing the bill for these oil and gas projects, while their only real benefactors would be the corporations involved. Secondly, oil and gas are terrible energy sources to rely on if a nation cares about sovereignty. Unlike renewable energy, they are hard to localize, meaning the source of the energy you use is not near the site of use. Whether it's in terms of jobs, transport, or electricity, this leaves oil and gas dependent nations subject to international market volatility and thus to the whims of hostile powers. We saw this recently in Europe following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it has now sparked a rapid transition away from gas and towards renewables in the European Union. The price you pay for energy under oil and gas is also determined by the global marketplace, and realistically, therefore, by what international oil and gas corporations decide they can charge you. The energy price you pay for is not largely determined right now by domestic policies or local infrastructure, giving you much less power over the energy you use and what it costs you. Oil and gas corporations have seen huge profits, over $10 billion in the first half of 2024 alone, while Canadians, by contrast, are facing hard economic times. As of 2023, for every additional dollar of inflation in Canada, 25 cents of that goes to oil and gas and mining extraction profits. The majority of those profits, in turn, go to the richest 1%, and very little of those profits end up in things like pension funds. We can easily find renewable solutions for when the wind doesn't blow or the sun doesn't shine by diversifying our energy grids, building connections between communities and provinces, building up electricity storage, and investing in energy efficiency. All those things also mean localized job creation, and if done right, mean communities gain more control over their energy supplies. The volatility of oil and gas can't be fixed domestically or locally, no matter how much money you pour into its development or how supposedly ethical the development is. Dependency on oil and gas also means energy workers need to travel far from their families for extended periods, and that we have to burn a huge amount of fossil fuels just to transport more fossil fuels to the location where it is needed. Oil and gas are incredibly inefficient sources of energy. You burn a lot of oil and gas just to move other oil and gas around. Thirdly, the energy race just isn't about oil and gas anymore, it's about renewables. Right now, globally, China is leading the way on cornering the supply chain for renewable energy equipment and related technologies. In many parts of the world, China now calls the shots on energy. If we want to secure our place in that marketplace, Canada must develop its own domestic renewable energy supply chain, something we are fully capable of doing. This is something we must do if we want to compete with countries like China and win the fight for future energy independence. Think about it this way. If competing with countries like China on energy is the new space race, then renewable projects are rockets and oil and gas projects are biplanes. You don't win a space race with biplanes. A lot of other countries, especially in the quote-unquote global south, are developing clean tech at paces ahead of North American countries. They are doing this because they want energy independence and because it makes sense. No leader in their right mind saw the Russian invasion of Ukraine and then said to themselves, seems like relying on natural gas is a good idea. Renewables make sense if you want sovereign control over energy. By contrast, in Canada, even when the production of oil and gas has increased recently, actual employment has fallen, as have royalties and the share the oil and gas industry plays in our economy. Oil and gas does not result in as many jobs as renewables, and again, the main obstacles for renewable energy in Canada are a need for more workers to fill positions and hostile policies that hold renewables back. There's been a lot of talk about data centers as of late and how their growth means increased energy demand. In Canada, if that demand is filled with renewable energy, the benefits are again localized. If it is filled by oil and gas, the benefits will largely evaporate into corporate profits. Fourthly, in terms of our list of reasons that corporate interests no longer align with Canada's interests, technology alone isn't enough to make a renewable future happen. We know this because the technology is largely already there in terms of renewables. What matters is the implementation of it. While provinces like Alberta occasionally mention they plan to invest in renewable technology development, the reality is their policies do everything they can to stall renewable growth. Because every power source that shifts from oil and gas to renewables is one less source of profit for oil and gas corporations, whose lobbyists spend huge amounts of time attempting to block renewable energy. The coming U.S. administration is promising to do everything in their power to stall renewable energy growth and alternatives and to bring back oil and gas dependency, something most Canadians would never actually agree to. These corporations are also aware that most Canadians do want action on climate change, are for renewable energy development, and no matter what happens in the next few years, are also waking up to the idea that oil and gas is the fuel of the past, and what is good for an oil and gas CEO is not good for Canadian workers or our economy. Indeed, recent polling by Abacus Data via Environmental Defence from December 2024 shows 53% of Canadians want governments to phase out the use and production of fossil fuels, while only 36% are opposed. Attacking Canadian climate policies like the emissions cap, which would spur green innovation and hold big polluters accountable, was a natural first step for oil and gas corporations. Because while oil and gas companies may talk about green innovation, history proves they fail entirely to innovate without strong regulations to hold them accountable to pollution. But they know that stalling domestic policies aimed at holding them to account is not a permanent solution, especially not when everything that is in the economic favor of Canada and Canadians is increasingly not the same thing as what profits oil and gas corporations. For these corporations, half measures and compromises are merely means to an end, a way of getting us to shed away principles like environmental protection, principles which can help us build localized power. You can see the thinking here in why oil and gas corporations would want us to become a US state. Direct control of Canada by a sympathetic US government would solve the problems of oil and gas corporations in one step. A US leader who can act legally as a king now, and who is hell-bent on blocking renewable energy development is a ticket to further profits for them. So why not put him in charge of Canada too? And even if all oil and gas CEOs are not necessarily on board with the complete annexation of Canada, they're certainly seeing the potential benefits of our sovereignty being reduced. And this is where it's important to point out, annexation doesn't necessarily need to be official. It also doesn't need to be done in one single step. A good litmus test for whether or not we are in fact maintaining independence is whether or not we are doing any of these things that are in our economic self-interest as a country, or whether we are simply letting big polluters do whatever they want to do without any restraint on their pollution. Those who annex countries usually don't use the word annexation when annexing them. By contrast, standing up for principles, whether that is for environmental protection or inclusivity, is our only way to prevent the erosion of our sovereignty, regardless of how you define that sovereignty. Because only through distinct identity and definition can a group survive annexation. And that doesn't mean buying into a hyper-nationalistic ideal or adhering to an image of a singular Canada. It just means placing ourselves apart from the beliefs of the next US administration and maintaining that distance. We're going to chat here a little bit about what you can do to oppose a US annexation of Canada, and here are some important steps. Step 1. Stand by principles that set us apart from the Trump administration and continue to push for renewable energy independence from oil and gas. Understand this threat to sovereignty is very real, but it can be opposed. The faster we get off oil and gas, the better off we'll be in terms of national independence. The fight for climate policies that hold big polluters to account and for renewable energy is vital to our continued sovereignty. We also have to stand by our principles, the things that define us as different from the US administration. Those principles include caring about environmental protection, holding big polluters accountable, and inclusivity and justice for the marginalized. In recent history, the US does not actually have a very successful track record of annexing other countries, at least not in the long term, and where they have been successful, it has largely come down to breaking the other country's sense of independent identity. The US, where it has won, has done so by preventing other countries from doing the things that help that country be more independent. In Canada's case, our energy path lies at the heart of our independence. Step 2. Understand that no one is coming to save us other than you yourself, and get organized. Organize across the spectrum of peaceful resistance and organize in your community now. It is better to be prepared early on for an onslaught of corporate-driven US propaganda than to leave it for later. This might mean working with existing groups in your community who are countering this propaganda or establishing new ones where others don't already exist. Calling out the garbage meant to convince Canadians to sacrifice our sovereignty or the things we believe in is more important now than ever. During the convoy occupation of Ottawa, one of the only things that actually proved effective was when counter-protesters calmly and peacefully told the incoming convoy participants to go home. Some people are already falling for the annexation propaganda. They need to be made aware calmly and peacefully that they are alone in their beliefs and that the rest of us do not want annexation. We'll have a link to full spectrum resistance thinking that you can check out below, as well as a link on how to talk to others about climate issues that may help. Step 3. Continue clear communication with the Americans you know to counter propaganda they may be hearing. I've met many Americans, and I've never truly sensed in the individual American a desire to invade or conquer others. When Americans have supported their government's foreign annexation attempts, it has been because they thought these actions were in the name of liberation or defense. A concerted effort will be made to try and convince the US public that Canadians want to be part of the United States. Ideas will be floated that will be made to sound reasonable, but which are stepping stones to annexation. Those ideas must be opposed publicly and peacefully, both in Canada and in the United States. Reach out to any US friends you have and make it clear to them that we do not want to be a US state, and that anything they hear on social media or in the news that suggests we do want to become a state or sacrifice our independence is a lie. Ask them to tell other Americans this and to call out any of their fellow Americans who claim Canada wants to join the United States. Step 4. Continue communicating with those in oil and gas dependent communities and provinces. You might be surprised to learn that support for things like climate action remains high even in places like Alberta. Indeed, many Albertans are actively fighting foreign coal interests that want to undermine local democracy there. Reach out to your contacts in these places and make sure they're also aware of what is happening. Step 5. Get online, but start creating backups. The digital world is an important place to communicate, and wherever voices are promoting annexation, we must be there to oppose it. It means sharing content, liking posts, and all of the above, but understand also that American companies control a lot of our social media. Developing lines of communication between each other that do not rely on social media sites is also important, whether that's in person or through different channels online. The same is true of mainstream media outlets. By all means, write letters to the editor, send media releases if you're part of a group, and always try to reach out to journalists, but stay informed via media sources that are not controlled by US conglomerates.
Even very trustworthy sources sometimes make mistakes.
I read a falsely comforting piece recently in CBC suggesting that all this US state talk by Trump is just intimidation towards negotiating better trade deals. This article quoted heavily supposed experts connected to the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, both of whom are climate denial groups. Since those connected to climate denial on social media seem pretty happy about the idea of Canada becoming a US state, I'm not convinced our mainstream media apparatus is thinking clearly on this topic, and I'm not convinced that they will be seeing this issue clearly in the near future if the climate denial groups are the ones that they are listening to.
Oil and gas industry think tanks are saying with one hand, don't worry about annexation, while the most ardent climate-denying supporters in Canada are being convinced to think of annexation as a good thing.
Mainstream media, sadly, has a habit of asking the fox what it plans to do with the chicken house and taking that as truthful. We will have a list of other independent media outlets, which I will link to below. There are many great journalists working at large organizations, but sadly, the newsroom can ultimately be controlled by owners, and editorial stances at those news outlets tend to fall for corporate propaganda lines on a regular basis. Step 6. Support or establish networks of mutual aid and support in your community. If the US government tries to use economic leverage against Canadians, then these networks, whether they be food banks or cooperatives or local community support groups, will become more important than ever. In closing, the people of the US and of Canada have a great deal in common. We are not enemies, and at the best of times we are great friends. Sierra Club Canada has a sister organization in the United States with whom we get along well and who are filled with great people. But we are not a chapter of their organization, nor are they a chapter of ours. And they do not ask us to become a chapter because they respect our autonomy, just as most Americans respect Canadian autonomy. That the greed of a few corporations has put us in this situation, both intentionally and unintentionally, where Canadian sovereignty is challenged, goes against anything the average Canadian or American actually believes in. Threats of annexation are, to quote a certain US president, sad, but they can and will be opposed.
Thank you for listening in to the Environment in Canada podcast. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, and on CHMA Radio in Sackville, New Brunswick on Saturdays at 11 a.m. Atlantic Daylight Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.